You can't force a machine like this to move. It either trusts you, or it doesn't. The voice came from somewhere behind the crowd, low and steady, almost lost beneath the restless murmur of hundreds gathered along the rail yard. But the tension in the air made every word land heavier than it should have. The big boy sat silent on the tracks, a towering monument of steel and history, its massive wheels locked in place, as if the earth itself had claimed it. Steam curled weakly from its valves, drifting into the dry afternoon air, carrying the faint scent of oil and heat. Cameras were rolling, reporters whispering into microphones, and a row of black SUVs idled near the platform, their tinted windows hiding officials who had already begun to lose patience. Jason Cole wiped a bead of sweat from his temple, his crisp blue engineering jacket already creased from hours of frustration. He glanced at the diagnostic tablet in his hand for what felt like the 100th time. Every system read green. Pressure levels were stable. Fuel flow was optimal. Electrical circuits were flawless. And yet the locomotive refused to move even an inch. "Run it again," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the chatter. A technician nearby hesitated before tapping commands into a laptop, the faint clicking of keys swallowed by the low hum of anticipation. The engine answered with a hollow hiss, a sound that echoed through the yard like a tired sigh, and then nothing. No surge, no motion, just silence. A ripple of unease spread through the team. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not today. Not in front of this many people. Jason clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of expectation pressing down harder with every passing second. This wasn't just a demonstration. It was a statement, a revival of something iconic, something meant to prove that history could still breathe. And right now, it looked like history was refusing. Off to the side, standing beyond the organized chaos, an old man watched without speaking. Earl Whitaker leaned slightly on one foot, his posture relaxed but his eyes fixed on the locomotive as if it were speaking a language no one else could hear. His jacket was faded, the kind of olive green that had long since lost its original color, and his hands, rough and steady, rested loosely at his sides. No badge, no credentials, just presence. A junior technician noticed him lingering and frowned. "Sir, you can't be standing here," he said, stepping closer with a forced politeness that barely masked irritation. Earl didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained on the engine, following the slow curl of steam as it escaped a valve near the front. "This area is restricted," the technician added, louder now, drawing a few glances from nearby crew members. Jason turned briefly, catching sight of the exchange. His patience, already stretched thin, snapped another inch. "We don't need spectators," he called out. "Especially not today." A few of the younger engineers chuckled under their breath, the tension bleeding into something sharper, more dismissive. Earl finally shifted his eyes, meeting the technician's gaze for just a moment. There was no challenge in them, no defiance. Just a quiet certainty that didn't belong in the middle of failure. Then he looked back at the locomotive. The wind moved lightly across the yard, brushing against the metal frame, and for a brief second, Earl tilted his head, as if listening to something beneath the noise, beneath the pressure, beneath everything the machines were insisting was perfectly fine. And in that stillness, something didn't add up. Jason Cole exhaled sharply, the sound edged with frustration as he turned away from the silent locomotive and stepped toward his team, his boots crunching against the gravel with controlled impatience. "We are not guessing," he said, loud enough for everyone within 20 feet to hear. "We are following data. If the system says everything is within tolerance, then the problem is operational, not mechanical." A few heads nodded quickly, eager to align with certainty, even if that certainty felt thinner by the minute. One of the technicians adjusted his headset, glancing nervously at the pressure gauge mounted along the side of the engine. The needle sat steady, unwavering, almost mocking them with its calm. Another engineer tapped his tablet again, scrolling through lines of diagnostics that all repeated the same message in different forms. No faults detected. No anomalies recorded. No explanation offered. Behind them, the crowd shifted, the low hum of conversation growing louder, more restless, as minutes stretched into something heavier. A reporter raised her voice slightly, speaking into her microphone about unexpected delays, her tone carefully neutral but edged with curiosity. The black SUVs remained still, engines idling, a quiet reminder that important people were waiting for something that was not happening. Jason felt it all pressing in, the expectation, the scrutiny, the silent countdown that no one had announced, but everyone could feel. He turned back toward the locomotive, eyes scanning its massive frame as if force of will alone could uncover what machines could not. Increase the ignition sequence timing by half a second, he ordered. Let us see if it is a synchronization issue. The technician hesitated again, then complied, fingers moving quickly. The engine responded with a deeper rumble this time, a brief surge of sound that made a few people in the crowd lean forward with hope, but it faded just as quickly, dissolving into the same hollow stillness that had settled over the yard. Jason's jaw tightened. Again, he said, sharper now. They ran it once more. The result did not change. Off to the side, Earl Whitaker shifted his weight slightly, his gaze never leaving the front assembly of the locomotive. The wind carried a faint metallic whistle past him, barely audible beneath the larger sounds. But his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, as if that small detail carried more weight than everything the screens were showing. The young technician who had approached him earlier stepped closer again, this time less polite, more insistent. Sir, I need you to move back now, he said, gesturing toward the outer perimeter. You are interfering with an active operation. Earl glanced at him briefly, then back at the engine. No, he said quietly. The word was not loud, but it landed with an unexpected firmness. The technician blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me. Jason noticed the exchange again and strode over, irritation now fully visible. What is the problem here, he asked. He will not clear the area, the technician replied quickly. Jason looked Earl up and down, taking in the worn jacket, the absence of any identifying badge, the stillness that felt out of place in the middle of controlled urgency. This is a restricted demonstration, Jason said, his tone clipped and official. If you do not have clearance, you need to step away immediately. Earl did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply kept his eyes on the locomotive and spoke as if he were stating something already decided. You are listening to the wrong things, he said. A few nearby engineers let out short, disbelieving laughs, the tension twisting into something sharper, almost defensive. Jason's expression hardened. We are listening to instruments designed by people who understand this system, he replied. With all due respect, sir, this is not guesswork. Earl's gaze remained steady. It is not guessing, he said. It is hearing what they cannot measure. The words hung in the air, quiet but disruptive, cutting against the rhythm of commands and data. For a moment, no one moved. Then Jason let out a breath that carried more disbelief than patience. We do not have time for this, he said, turning away. Get him out of here. The technician stepped forward again, reaching out as if to guide Earl back. But before he could say another word, a faint sound slipped through the noise once more, a thin, uneven whisper of steam escaping from somewhere it should not have been, and this time, Earl did not just hear it. He recognized it. The sound was faint, almost embarrassed by its own existence, a thin, uneven hiss that slipped between the heavier breaths of the engine, but to Earl Whitaker it stood out like a wrong note in a familiar song. His eyes traced the length of the locomotive again, slower this time, ignoring the flashing screens and the hurried voices behind him, focusing instead on the rhythm of pressure, the way the steam curled, the way the metal seemed to hold its breath instead of releasing it. There, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, his chin lifting a fraction toward the forward valve assembly just beneath the main cylinder housing. The technician beside him followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual, just polished steel, secured fittings, and gauges that all confirmed stability. There is nothing wrong there, the technician insisted, his tone tightening with irritation. We already checked that section twice. Earl did not argue. He simply took a small step forward, the gravel shifting softly under his boots, and for the first time his hand lifted slightly, not touching the machine, just hovering near it as if feeling something that could not be seen. Jason Cole turned back again, catching the movement, his patience now worn thin by repetition and pressure. I said remove him, Jason snapped, his voice carrying farther this time, drawing the attention of more onlookers and several members of the crew. The air shifted, tension tightening like a wire pulled too far. A few of the younger engineers watched with open skepticism, arms crossed, their confidence in modern systems now turning into quiet defensiveness. Earl's hand lowered slowly, but his eyes did not leave the valve. "It is not seated right," he said, calm and certain. "It is close enough to pass your readings, but not enough to hold pressure where it needs to." A short laugh broke from one of the engineers nearby, sharp and dismissive. "That is not how these systems work," the man said. "Everything is calibrated to within fractions of an inch. If it was off, the sensors would catch it." Earl nodded once, not disagreeing, just acknowledging the logic. "The sensors are listening for failure," he said. "This is hesitation." The word hung there, strange and out of place among technical terms and measured data. Jason stepped closer now, his posture rigid, his authority clear. "Sir, I do not know who you are, but you are done speaking," he said. "We are on a federal schedule, and you are interfering with a controlled operation." Earl finally turned his head fully, meeting Jason's eyes. There was no challenge in his expression, no anger, only a steady weight that seemed older than the moment itself. "You are trying to make it move," Earl said. "It is trying to tell you why it cannot." For a brief second, Jason hesitated, not because he agreed, but because something in the delivery did not fit the situation, did not match the usual noise of uninformed opinions. Then the hesitation passed. "Enough," he said, gesturing sharply. "Get him out." The technician reached again, firmer this time, but before his hand could make contact, a sudden fluctuation rippled through the engine, not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle shift in the tone of the idle pressure, like a breath catching mid-cycle. Several heads turned at once. The technician at the console frowned, eyes flicking to his screen. "That is odd," he muttered. The readings were still green, still stable, but the sound had changed, just enough to feel wrong. Earl did not move. "It is leaking where it should be sealing," he said softly. "Not enough to trigger your alarms. Just enough to stop it from trusting the pressure." The word trust again, out of place, and yet somehow fitting. Jason looked from the screen to the engine, then back again, irritation now mixed with something less certain. Behind them, the crowd quieted slightly, sensing the shift without understanding it. And somewhere beneath the polished certainty of modern diagnostics, a small, persistent doubt began to take hold. Jason Cole did not speak right away, and that silence alone was enough to ripple through the crew like an unseen current. Because up until that moment, he had always had an answer ready, always had a command to give, always had something concrete to stand on. But now his eyes lingered on the locomotive longer than before, tracing the exact area Earl had indicated, and for the first time, the confidence in his posture shifted, not collapsing, not yet, but bending just enough to be noticed. "Pull up the pressure variance logs," he said finally, his voice lower, more controlled, and the technician at the console moved quickly, fingers flying across the screen, bringing up a detailed graph that showed a steady line, almost perfect in its consistency, almost too perfect. Jason narrowed his eyes. "Zoom in," he added. The graph expanded, revealing micro fluctuations so small they were nearly invisible unless you knew to look for them. Tiny dips and recoveries that did not trigger any alarms, did not register as faults, but formed a pattern that was not supposed to be there. "It is within tolerance," the technician said, though his voice carried less certainty now. Earl shifted slightly, the faint creak of his jacket barely audible as he spoke again. "Within tolerance is not the same as right," he said. The words settled into the space between data and instinct, and no one laughed this time. A gust of wind moved through the yard, brushing against the side of the locomotive, and the thin, uneven hiss returned, just for a moment, like a whisper that refused to be ignored. Jason exhaled slowly, then turned back toward Earl, studying him more carefully now, not as a distraction, but as a variable he had not accounted for. "You said it is not seated right," Jason said. "Where exactly?" Earl lifted his hand again, pointing this time with quiet precision toward a narrow seam along the forward valve assembly, a place so small it looked insignificant compared to the massive structure surrounding it. "There," he said. "It is aligned enough to pass inspection, but not enough to hold under load. It bleeds pressure before it can build." The technician closest to that section frowned and stepped forward, crouching slightly to examine the area. He ran his gloved fingers along the seam, feeling for irregularities, but everything appeared flush, smooth, exactly as it should be. "It is sealed," he said, though now it sounded more like a question than a statement. Earl shook his head once, subtle but certain. "It looks sealed," he replied. "It is not the same thing." Jason's gaze moved between the technician and the valve, then back to the data still glowing on the tablet in his hand. Everything he had trusted was still telling him there was no problem, and yet the machine itself was refusing to agree. Behind them, the crowd had grown quieter, conversations fading into low murmurs as people sensed the shift in tone, the moment stretching into something more than just a delay. One of the reporters lowered her microphone slightly, watching instead of speaking, as if instinctively understanding that something important was about to unfold. Jason made a decision, small on the surface, but heavy with implication. "Check the manual alignment," he said. The technician hesitated. "That will require breaking the seal," he replied. "It is not in the protocol unless there is a confirmed fault." Jason held his gaze for a second longer. "Then consider this confirmation," he said. The words hung in the air, marking a clear break from procedure, from certainty, from everything that had failed them so far. The technician nodded slowly and reached for his tools, the metallic click echoing softly as he prepared to open a section that had already been declared perfect. Earl stepped back slightly, giving space, his eyes never leaving the point he had identified. The wind moved again, carrying with it that same faint, uneven whisper, and this time, more than one person heard it. It was no longer just a sound. It was a question. And for the first time that day, the answer was not coming from a screen. The metallic click of the tool against the housing sounded louder than it should have, echoing across the quiet that had settled over the yard as the technician hesitated for just a fraction of a second before breaking the factory seal, a motion that felt almost irreversible despite how small it seemed. A thin line, separated with a soft release of pressure, barely audible, but enough to draw every nearby eye toward the exposed seam. "Easy," Jason said, his voice controlled but tight, as if even now he was trying to hold onto the structure of command that had carried him this far. The technician adjusted his grip and carefully opened the panel, revealing the internal alignment mechanism, a series of precisely machined components that gleamed under the afternoon light, each part appearing exactly as it should be. "I am not seeing anything out of place," he said, leaning closer, his brow furrowed as he traced the edges with a gloved finger. The crowd leaned in without moving, their silence deepening, their attention now fully captured by something they did not fully understand but could feel shifting. Earl Whitaker stepped forward just enough to see inside, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the alignment, not the whole system, just one point where two surfaces met with near perfection. "There," he said quietly, indicating a fraction of a gap that no one else had noticed, so small it barely existed, a difference measured in less than the thickness of a sheet of paper. The technician squinted, adjusting his position, then paused. It is slightly off," he admitted, his voice lowering as realization began to replace certainty. Jason stepped closer immediately, his attention sharpening. "How much?" he asked. The technician hesitated, then answered carefully. "Less than a 1/16 of an inch," he said. "Within tolerance." Earl shook his head again, the motion calm, deliberate. "Not for this," he said. The words carried no force, no urgency, but they landed heavier than any command that had been given all day. Jason looked from the gap to the readings still glowing green on the tablet in his hand, then back again, and something in his expression shifted, not fully surrendering, but no longer dismissing. "Can it be adjusted?" he asked. The technician nodded slowly. "Yes, but it will take manual correction. The system will not do it automatically because it does not recognize this as a fault." Jason held his gaze for a moment, then gave a short, decisive nod. "Do it." The technician reached for a smaller tool, adjusting the alignment with careful, incremental movements, each turn measured, each adjustment deliberate. The sound was subtle, a faint tightening of metal against metal, a correction so small. It should not have mattered, and yet everyone watching felt the weight of it. Earl remained still, his eyes fixed on the mechanism, listening not just for sound, but for absence, for the moment when something that had been wrong would finally go quiet. The wind shifted again, brushing across the locomotive, and for a brief second, the uneven whisper returned, then softened, then faded entirely. The technician stopped, his hand hovering. "That is as close as it can get," he said. Jason looked at him, then at the engine, then at Earl. No one spoke. The moment stretched, balanced on something invisible. "Seal it," Jason said finally. The panel was closed, the seal reset, the system restored to its original state, but something about it felt different now, not in the data, not in the readings, but in the way the machine held itself, as if it were no longer resisting. Jason stepped back, drawing a breath that felt heavier than it should have. "Run it," he said. The command moved through the team instantly, fingers returning to keys, systems engaging once more, but this time, no one was watching the screens. Every eye was on the locomotive itself, waiting for it to answer. The command traveled through the system in less than a second, but the moment that followed stretched far longer, as if the entire rail yard had paused to listen. A low mechanical hum began to build beneath the locomotive, deeper this time, steadier, no longer hesitant. Steam gathered along the valves, not in weak, uneven curls, but in controlled, deliberate releases that moved with rhythm instead of resistance. Jason Cole stood motionless, his eyes locked on the massive driving wheels, no longer glancing at his tablet, no longer searching for confirmation from data that had already failed him. "Ignition sequence holding," a technician said quietly, almost as if speaking too loudly might interrupt whatever was happening. Another voice followed, softer than before, stripped of earlier certainty. "Pressure is building, steady." The words sounded different now, not like reports, but like observations, like something being witnessed rather than controlled. The engine responded with a rising tone, a layered sound that carried weight, not just noise but presence, a deep resonance that settled into the ground beneath their feet. The steel frame seemed to come alive in increments, subtle at first, a tightening here, a shift there, as if every part was finally agreeing with the others. The crowd leaned forward almost as one, drawn into the moment without realizing it, conversations fading completely into silence. Cameras remained raised, but no one spoke into them anymore. There was nothing to narrate, only to watch. Earl Whitaker stood exactly where he had been, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, but his eyes followed the motion of the machine with quiet attention, not anticipation, not hope, but recognition. He had heard this before. Jason took a slow step forward, the gravel crunching beneath his boot louder than it should have been in the stillness. "Bring it up," he said, but the command lacked its earlier sharpness, replaced by something more measured, almost careful. The technician nodded, adjusting the controls with deliberate precision. The engine answered. A deeper surge rolled through the locomotive, not forced, not strained, but natural, as if it had been waiting for permission that no system could grant. The first movement was almost imperceptible, a fraction of an inch, a shift so small it could have been imagined, but then it came again, stronger, undeniable. The massive wheels turned, slow at first, then with gathering confidence, steel against steel creating a sound that echoed through the yard like a long-held breath finally released. A collective intake of air passed through the crowd, not loud, not dramatic, but unified. Jason stopped walking. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The locomotive was moving, not because it had been forced, not because the system had demanded it, but because something had finally been set right. The technician at the console stared at the readings, then back at the engine, then back again, as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer matched. "All systems, normal," he said, but the words felt smaller now, less important than what stood right in front of them. Jason slowly lowered the tablet in his hand. For the first time that day, he was not looking for confirmation. He was looking at the result. The train gathered momentum, smooth, controlled, powerful without effort, the kind of movement that did not need to prove itself because it simply was. The wind shifted again, carrying the sound of the engine across the yard, and where there had once been that faint, uneven whisper, there was now nothing. No hesitation, no resistance, just silence where the problem used to live. Jason turned his head, his gaze finding Earl. There were questions there, many of them, but none that could be asked in that moment. Because the answer was already standing there, quiet, steady, and no longer possible to ignore. For a moment, no one moved, not even as the locomotive continued forward with steady, undeniable power, its massive frame gliding along the rails with a confidence that had been completely absent just minutes before. The sound filled the yard, not overwhelming, but commanding, a deep mechanical rhythm that settled into the chest and stayed there. Jason Cole remained where he stood, the tablet still in his hand, but now forgotten, his attention fixed entirely on the man who had never raised his voice, never argued, never needed to prove anything. Around them, the crew slowly began to shift, the tension that had once driven their movements replaced by something quieter, something harder to define. One of the younger engineers lowered his arms, no longer crossed in skepticism, his posture loosening as realization settled in. Another glanced back at the open panel, then at Earl, then away again, as if trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he had been trained to trust. The technician who had made the adjustment stepped back from the locomotive, his tool still in hand, his expression no longer defensive but thoughtful, almost unsettled. "It was barely off," he said under his breath, not to anyone in particular. "Barely." Earl Whitaker did not respond. He simply watched the train as it moved past, his eyes following the alignment of motion, listening not for sound now, but for consistency, for the absence of resistance that told him everything was finally working as it should. A light breeze passed through again, brushing against his jacket, carrying the clean, even rhythm of the engine with it, and for the first time since he had stepped into the yard, there was nothing left to listen for. The problem was gone. Near the platform, one of the black SUVs came to a slow stop, its engine cutting off with a soft hum that barely registered against the sound of the moving locomotive. The rear door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, his posture composed, his gaze sharp as it scanned the scene before. Settling on the train, then shifting toward the small cluster of engineers, and finally resting on Earl. There was a pause, subtle but deliberate, as recognition passed across his face, not surprise, not confusion, but something closer to confirmation. He did not approach immediately. Instead, he stood still, watching, as if allowing the moment to complete itself before stepping into it. Jason noticed him, his eyes flicking briefly toward the arrival, then back to Earl, the connection between the two forming silently, without explanation. The crew followed his glance, their attention shifting, their awareness expanding beyond the machine to the presence now standing just outside their immediate circle. No one spoke. No one needed to. The locomotive continued its path down the track, smooth and unwavering, leaving behind the place where it had once refused to move, as if that moment had already become something distant, something resolved. Earl adjusted his stance slightly, the movement small, almost unnoticeable, but enough to suggest that his part in this was finished. He did not step forward. He did not step back. He simply remained where he was, as he had been from the beginning, quiet, steady, and now impossible to overlook. And as the man in the suit finally began to walk toward him, the atmosphere shifted once more, not with urgency, not with tension, but with a quiet understanding that whatever was about to happen next had been set in motion long before anyone in that yard had realized who they were standing beside. The man in the dark suit did not rush, his steps measured against the gravel as he moved closer, each footfall deliberate, carrying a weight that did not come from urgency, but from certainty. And as he approached, the subtle shift in the crew became more pronounced, conversations that had already faded now disappearing completely, replaced by a stillness that felt almost instinctive. Jason Cole straightened slightly, his posture adjusting without thought, recognizing something in the man's presence that demanded attention even before a word was spoken. The man's gaze remained fixed on Earl Whitaker, not scanning, not questioning, but steady, as if confirming something long known rather than newly discovered. When he stopped a few feet away, he did not immediately speak. He simply stood there, taking in the quiet figure before him, the worn jacket, the steady hands, the calm that had never broken even when everything else had. "Earl Whitaker," he said finally, his voice low but clear, carrying across the small circle that had formed around them. It was not a question. Earl turned his head slightly, meeting the man's eyes, and gave a small nod, nothing more. The man's expression softened, not into a smile, but into something close to respect, something earned rather than offered. "It has been a long time," he continued, and there was history in the words, the kind that did not need to be explained to be understood. Around them, the engineers exchanged glances, the names settling into the air, unfamiliar to some, but not to all. One of the older crew members, standing farther back, straightened abruptly, recognition flashing across his face as if a memory had just been pulled from somewhere deep and long untouched. Jason looked between them, his earlier authority now replaced by a quiet curiosity, his understanding shifting in real time. "Sir," he said carefully to the man in the suit. "We did not realize." The man lifted a hand slightly, stopping the explanation before it could begin, his attention still on Earl. "You were not supposed to," he said. The words were not harsh, but they carried a finality that made further explanation unnecessary. He took a small step closer, closing the distance, and for a moment, the two men simply stood there, the noise of the moving locomotive now a steady backdrop rather than the center of attention. "They told me you had stepped away from all of this," the man said. Earl's gaze shifted briefly toward the train as it continued down the track, smooth and unwavering, then back again. "I did," he replied, his voice quiet, unchanged. The man nodded once, as if that answer confirmed something important. "And yet," he said, glancing toward the locomotive, "it seems it still listens to you." A faint ripple moved through the group, not laughter, not disbelief, but something closer to awe, a recognition that what they had just witnessed was no longer just a technical correction. Jason lowered his eyes for a moment, then looked back at Earl, seeing him now not as an interruption, not as a distraction, but as the missing piece in a system that had otherwise been perfect on paper and incomplete in reality. "Why did the system not catch it?" Jason asked, the question directed as much at himself as at Earl. Earl did not answer right away. He let the sound of the locomotive carry for a second longer, the steady rhythm filling the space between them. "Because it was not broken," he said at last. "It just was not right." The distinction settled into the silence, simple, undeniable. The man in the suit glanced once more at Earl, then gave a slight nod, the kind that did not need witnesses but had them anyway. And in that moment, without ceremony, without announcement, the balance in the yard shifted completely, not with noise, not with applause, but with the quiet weight of understanding that had finally caught up to what had been standing there all along. The locomotive continued down the track until its massive form became smaller against the horizon, its steady rhythm fading into the distance, but never losing its presence, as if the sound itself had settled into the memory of everyone standing there, leaving behind a silence that felt fuller than any noise that had come before. No one rushed to fill it. No one spoke over it. They simply stood, watching the space where the machine had once refused to move, now empty, now resolved. Jason Cole finally lowered his head slightly, the tension that had defined his posture all day easing into something quieter, something more grounded. He looked at his hands, then at the tablet still dimly glowing with perfect readings that no longer meant what they had earlier, and then back at Earl Whitaker. There was no embarrassment in his expression, no attempt to recover authority. Just recognition. "I should have listened sooner," he said, his voice steady but stripped of its earlier edge. Earl did not respond immediately. He shifted his weight slightly, the small movement enough to break the stillness around him, and glanced once more down the track where the train had disappeared. "It would not have changed anything," he said calmly. "You had to hear it for yourself." Jason absorbed that, the words settling deeper than a simple correction, carrying something that extended beyond the machine, beyond the moment. Around them, the crew began to move again, but slower now, more deliberate, as if each action carried more thought than before. The technician who had adjusted the alignment carefully placed his tools back into his kit, his movements precise, respectful, as if the act itself had gained new meaning. The younger engineers no longer laughed, no longer exchanged confident remarks. They watched, they listened, and in their silence, something had shifted that no system could measure. The man in the dark suit remained where he stood, his gaze moving briefly from Earl to the team, taking in the quiet transformation that had taken place without instruction, without command. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, then stepped back, allowing the space to belong to those who had been part of it. Earl reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a small, weathered leather pouch, the edges softened by time, the surface marked with years of use. He looked at it for a moment, his thumb brushing across the snap, then closed his hand around it again and returned it to his pocket without opening it. There was nothing left to fix, nothing left to prove. Jason watched that simple motion, understanding more from it than any explanation could have given him. "Will you stay?" he asked, the question quiet, almost hesitant. Earl shook his head once, the answer gentle but final. "No," he said. "It runs now." He turned slightly, not in haste, not in retreat, but with the same calm certainty he had carried from the beginning, and began to walk away from the yard, his steps steady against the gravel, his figure gradually blending into the edges of the place, as if he had always been part of it, and now simply returned to it. No one stopped him. No one called out. They watched, not out of obligation, but out of respect that had formed without being asked. The wind moved once more across the tracks, carrying only the clean, even echo of a machine that had found its rhythm again, and in that quiet, the lesson remained, not spoken, not written, but understood. Some things do not need to be forced to move forward. They just need someone who knows how to listen.